Welcome back, everyone, as we dive back into some more of our favorite non-historian, Philomena Cunk. If you are not familiar with her, it's actually a role portrayed by an actress named Diane Morgan, who pretends to be a complete moron when it comes to interviewing historians about historic events, and the results are pretty funny if you like this style of humor, which I really do. So what we're going to do, as I do with all of these videos, is we're going to watch, we're going to laugh along, we're going to be entertained, but then I'm also going to try to offer some real historical commentary, give some background, give some information so we can laugh, but also actually learn a little bit in the process. So join me on the journey. Today we're going to dive into some excerpts from Episode 2 of Cunk on Britain, The Empire Strikes Back. So specifically, we're going to be looking at what she has to say about the Tudors. So Henry VIII and his children who sat on the throne. Let's go ahead and see what it's all about.
And finishing them in another.
And looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them.
Henry didn't get arrested after he killed his first wife, did he? What sort of mistakes did the Tudor police make that led him to kill again?
So, right off the bat, he didn't kill his first wife. I mean, I guess she probably means the first wife that he killed. People often say divorced, beheaded, and died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So he divorces Catherine of Aragon. He has Anne Boleyn executed on trumped-up charges of adultery. It was actually just a way for, I think, probably motivated primarily by Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry's kind of right-hand man at the time, getting rid of all of the enemies. So they accused these other guys that they probably had reasons to get rid of sleeping with Anne, had them all executed. Jane Seymour dies from complications of childbirth, giving him his son. He divorces Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard really did cheat on Henry and was executed probably as a teenager still. And then Catherine Parr outlived him.
All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
United Britain of Great Kingdom.
Last week, we discovered how God invented Britain, who the Romans were,
Bath.
and why we went to war with the Roses. But that was just the beginning. By the time the Wars of the Roses ended, Britain was literally on the map, somewhere near the top, showing how important it was.
The British had a firm grasp of the solid parts of the country, like this rock. But there was a load of stuff around the edges that wouldn't do as it was told. It was wet, it was full of fish, and it wouldn't make up its mind how close to the rock it wanted to be.
In this episode, I'll discover how Britain came to rule the waves and invent the empire.
It's a story about events beyond Britain's coastline, so I'll be using the C word a lot. Sea.
This is Hampton Court Palace, a building so impressive it has to be accompanied by harpsichord music.
It has to be. Oh, man. So Hampton Court Palace was actually built by Cardinal Wolsey, who was, for a time, Henry VIII's chancellor, and had a falling out with Henry because he couldn't secure Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. And at some point along the way in all of this, Hampton Court Palace is transferred to Henry.
These days, Hampton Court is open 10 till 4:30 in the winter, 10 till 6 in the summer, with last entry to the maze 45 minutes before closing. Prices start at £18.40 per adult and £9.20 per child. A family ticket will set you back at least £32.30, unless you're buying that ticket in the 15th century and your family name is Tudor.
Nice.
But what do we mean by the word Tudor? Let's ask an expert.
What do we mean by the word Tudor?
The word Tudor is quite controversial because the Tudors at the time didn't call themselves Tudor. Tudor is the family name, the Welsh family name of the ancestors on the father's side of King Henry VII, but the only person who calls Henry VII Henry Tudor is Richard III when he's trying to stop him becoming king. And he uses the name Tudor just to mean this is some random Welsh person rather than an appropriate person to replace me as.
Right, because Henry Tudor's claim to the throne really comes through his mother. On his father's side, he is actually descended from Catherine of Valois, who was French nobility and becomes Queen of England to Henry V. And then after Henry V dies, she has a couple of children with this kind of nobody from Wales named Owen Tudor, or Owen ap Tudor, as it would have been in Welsh. And to talk about his family name would have been to remind everyone that he was not descended through a male line of any kind of nobility.
King. So the Tudors don't use the name Tudor very much at all. Some people refer to it as being their family name later on.
Sorry, I had that thing, where your brain stops listening.
If the Tudors were the Kardashians of their time, this was their Kim. Henry VIII, the kingiest king who ever kinged over Britain.
If you had to draw a king, you'd definitely draw him, although maybe not as well as this, unless you're a 16th century portrait artist.
Yeah, most of the portraits we have from that time, the really good ones, are from a guy named Hans Holbein, who very famously makes the portrait that convinces Henry to marry Anne of Cleves. But then he sees her in person and says she looks like a horse. They call her a Flanders mare. He says she looks nothing like she did in the portrait. He basically feels like he got catfished. And it's important to note that Henry did not look like that for most of his life. We always think of Henry VIII as fat. That was really only the end of his life. He was very handsome, very athletic, was a regular jouster, and it's probably jousting that led to him getting fat. He got this really bad injury in the 1530s in his leg, and it festered and had pus and smelled and was awful for the rest of his life. And he kind of stopped being so athletic and active and started eating a lot and just ballooned up in the last decade or so of his life.
But what was so great about Henry VIII? Why is he the king we all still remember?
It's interesting to see that drawing, the way they prominently show his calves, because a lot of people who visited Henry VIII's court would talk specifically about what great calves he had.
Unlike, say, Richard V. Well, for one thing,
There's no
he
Richard
was
V.
fat, so he takes up more room in the memory. But Henry's also memorable for his chronic wife addiction. He had 6 wives, all called Catherine.
He was a Catherine-aholic.
He was a Catherine-aholic. There were 3 Catherines, not 6.
Catholic for short.
He got through so many Catherines, he actually got bored of killing them and had to invent a new way of getting rid of them, called
He only killed 1 Catherine.
divorce.
The Pope hated divorce, so Henry decided to divorce him. He took back control, broke with Europe, and made up a new religion, which it turns out is easier to do than popes like to pretend.
Henry created the Church of England, didn't he? Did he have to find a British pope?
He didn't need to find a British pope. You could just have bishops. You can just use the bishops and people that you've got in there already.
If you had to find...
Yeah, but Henry made himself the head of the Church of England. Now, as I've mentioned other times we've talked about Henry VIII, to the end of his life, considered himself to be Catholic. He just didn't want to be under the authority of the Pope, because he felt like as a divinely anointed king that there shouldn't be anyone who had any sort of authority over him in his own country, and that included the church. So he felt that the king should also be head of the church. So he made himself that. And people like John Fisher, who was a cardinal, Catholic cardinal, Sir Thomas More, are executed for refusing to recognize Henry as head of the church. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury becomes the supreme kind of religious figure in the Church of England, but the king is still over him. And even today, King Charles III is the supreme governor of the Church of England.
And a British pope now, who would you go for?
You couldn't use the Archbishop of Canterbury.
No, you have to have someone else.
Someone from without the church.
Yeah, like Matt Baker of The One Show.
So you're Matt Baker off The One Show.
He's not an obvious choice, you see. That's why I think he'd be good. But the more you think about it, the more it makes sense.
Henry of VIII kept having a go on new wives because he wanted a boy to pop out of one of them, and eventually one did, called Edward. When Henry died, Edward became king, aged just 9 years old.
Yeah, so Edward is the son of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. She dies afterwards of what they called childbed fever, some kind of an infection. Same thing that Henry's mother died of in her late 30s, Elizabeth of York. And even though there's a lot of fictional parts to the TV show The Tudors, there's this very poignant scene when Henry VIII, played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, who's just fantastic, is standing in the doorway of his wife's bedroom, and he's looking at her, and he says to someone, "It's childbed fever. I know because my mother died of it." And that was a hard time in Henry's life. So the Lord Protector then, under the young Edward VI, is going to be Edward's uncle, who is Jane Seymour's brother. And two of Jane Seymour's brothers are prominent in the government. One of them, Thomas Seymour, actually marries Henry's widow, Catherine Parr, and she dies from childbirth. And both Thomas and Edward Seymour are both going to be executed for treason against the government, even though they are the uncles of the king.
Edward died aged 15, the youngest anyone had ever died of old age.
The youngest anyone. So he probably had tuberculosis, and there are a lot of people that think that because Henry was so obsessed with having a son, and when he finally had a son who survived childhood, that he kind of tucked him away and kept him protected, and they would like scrub the home that he was living in several times a day, and they think that they never really gave his immune system a chance to build up any kind of protection against things because they kept him so protected.
He was followed as king by Lady Jane Grey. She ruled for 9 glorious days, almost a week. These were among the fastest royals we've ever had.
So Jane Grey is the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. And the reason that at the last minute, right before he dies, Edward VI changes his will to try and get the succession to pass to her instead of to his older sister Mary, who had been barred from the throne previously, but everything kind of goes back and forth. Mary and Elizabeth were both declared bastards because Henry basically disowned his marriages to their mothers. But everything kept getting changed. But Jane Grey, she makes one big mistake, or the people who put her on the throne, because she's kind of a pawn in all this. She's Protestant, which is why they want to go to her rather than Mary. But what happens is they don't secure Mary first. They put her on the throne and they announce her as queen before making sure that they had Mary in possession. And so Mary's out there while Jane's being proclaimed as queen, gathering loyal followers, and she comes in and basically dethrones her. And everything's okay for a while for Jane, but then people try to do an uprising against Mary on behalf of Jane, and this time she has her executed.
After Jane came this woman, Queen Mary. And there really was something about Mary, but not something funny like Cameron Diaz with all dried spunk in her hair. Mary's something was religious intolerance.
Mary's something was religious intolerance. And it's not unique to Mary. Religious intolerance was kind of the name of the game on both sides. The Protestants persecuted Catholics. The Catholics persecuted Protestants. A lot of Protestants were persecuted by Henry VIII, were burned at the stake, things like that. Because again, he thought himself as a loyal Catholic. And so then Mary is known as Bloody Mary for the stuff that goes on during her reign. Thomas Cranmer, for example, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, is burned at the stake during all of this.
She had so many Protestants burnt at the stake. She became known as Bloody Mary because, like the drink, she was horrible.
The next queen was Queen Elizabeth, who in the first of many such coincidences appeared just in time for the Elizabethan era.
Westminster Abbey, amazing place.
Queen Elizabeth I got a crown screwed on here in Westminster Abbey.
Westminster Abbey. So you actually go in, if you ever visit, over to the left from as we're looking at the screen, and then you go down, the entrance is on the other side. This is where you come out, but right inside these doors is where you have, for example, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. And during non-coronation times, as soon as you would go in those doors, right to the right behind, I think it's plexiglass or something, is where the coronation chair is on display, that you can see it normally. And then you start immediately having all these graves of like a lot of prime ministers are right there, and then up to the left, not too far in, is where you're going to see like Stephen Hawking and Isaac Newton, and it's just an amazing place. You can't go in that way. She trips.
Elizabeth I was a new sort of king, in that she was a queen, which meant she got paid less and sat on horses sideways. To stop persecution, Elizabeth allowed her subjects to practice whatever religion they liked, as long as they pretended to be Church of England when asked, like middle-class people do when they want their kids to go to a posh school. During Elizabeth's reign, British culture flourished, especially the world of theatre, which is sadly still with us to this day.
She has this ongoing joke through all of her videos, and there's a lot I haven't seen yet, but where she trashes theatre on a regular basis.
The greatest playwright of the age was Will.I.am Shakespeare. It's often said if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be sending his scripts to television and film companies. It wouldn't make them because they were so long and boring.
So she's standing there in front of the Globe Theatre, which is a reproduction of the Globe Theatre where Shakespeare's plays would have been originally done, because in 1666 there's this horrible fire that destroys huge parts of old London.
But while audiences thrilled to the tedious drama of Shakespeare's terrible plays, some pioneering Britons were experiencing real drama by going out exploring.
So it's important to note, too, that Shakespeare writes his plays during the Tudor period. So a lot of people consider his plays to be Tudor propaganda. That's what really one of the places where Richard III begins to get eviscerated as this evil hunchback, and that perpetuated for a long, long time. And there's some truth to all of that stuff, right? As is the case with a lot of history. Even when it's propaganda, there's probably some truth to it, but it's been spun with a particular bias for a particular reason.
It was now the British got really into boats, by getting into boats.
Sailors of the time were like spacemen, but on water,
True.
exploring the unknown, armed only with an engineless wooden car called a boat, and a sort of basic paper sat-nav called a map, which had hardly anything on it, because hardly anything had been found yet.
On maps of the sea, do they show the hills? You know, the little moving hills with the white bit on top?
The waves.
Is that what they call the moving?
I'm impressed that he figured out she was talking about waves, because I couldn't figure out what the heck she was talking about. This guy is one of my favorites that she interviews, because he looks so serious and so stern, but he just rolls with whatever she says.
Hills with the white bits on top.
I think that's what you mean.
Did an explorer ever try to sail into the sky? You know, find a bit of sea that's sort of going up and...
No.
Despite the difficulty, Queen Elizabeth sent a load of sailors over the sea.
She keeps calling her King Queen, but there's actually a speech that she gives to soldiers right around the time of the Spanish Armada, when the Spanish are going to invade England, because Elizabeth, who is fully Protestant as Queen of England, basically the Pope basically gives people carte blanche to invade the country and get rid of the Protestants to restore Catholicism. And there's no greater strong power for Catholicism in Europe than the Spanish. And Mary, Queen Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, had been married to King Philip of Spain. So she gives this speech, and among other things, she's wearing armor, and she's on her horse, and she says, I may be a woman or a queen, or I don't remember the exact words, but she said, but I have the heart of a king, the heart and stomach of a king, I think she says, and a king of England, too. So there's some truth to the whole king-queen thing.
To nick treasure off the Spanish, and then to nick whole countries off whichever brown people were standing on them at the time. The first British explorer to do this was Sir Walter Raleigh.
Sir Walter Raleigh was a great sailor, wasn't he? So why is it today we only remember him for his bikes?
Well, there might have been a connection between that branch of the Raleigh family and the later bike manufacturer, but I very much doubt it. People weren't using cycles of any kind in Sir Walter Raleigh's days.
Oh, really?
I think we really have to accept that Sir Walter Raleigh was just an expert sailor.
Yeah, and he's also the capital of North Carolina, is named after him.
Did Sir Walter Raleigh invent the potato?
Well, he didn't invent the potato in that I don't think anyone actually has ever invented a root vegetable, because they're obviously being cultivated and used by people living in the Americas when he arrived there.
When Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, was he scared of them?
I think that when Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, not that we've any documented records on the moment when he first beheld a potato or a field of potatoes, but I don't think he was scared of them. This is a buccaneer.
My man's got some weird ears, though. Can we acknowledge that? But he does such a great job keeping it serious here. If you ever visit Westminster Abbey, there's a little church on the property that's right next to Westminster Abbey, and you can go in there, and that's where Sir Walter Raleigh is buried. He was beheaded, I think, under King James I, and he's buried in that church. And eventually I'll get it edited, and you'll see the video from my visit to his grave there.
In character, and I think that he probably was able to take on and manage his emotions whilst engaging with potatoes at first sight.
We still celebrate potatoes to this day by buying and eating them. It's amazing to think that Queen Elizabeth was the first British monarch to be impressed by a baked potato, and the last.
Don't bite it. Oh my gosh, she bit the potato.
Walter Raleigh was big news, but he wasn't quite as big news as Sir Francis Drake.
This is Drake's ship,
Uncle Francis. All
Golden Hind.
right, I made the video. If you didn't see the video about the drinking game, check that video out. I'll throw it in the link at the end. But Francis Drake is my uncle. I'm descended from, I think, a brother of his.
Which is Tudor for Horse of Gold. It was in this ship Drake became the first person to circumcise the globe, which is probably why this sort of ship is called a clipper. Imagine being on deck in that perilous age. You're in the middle of the ocean, a mighty thunderstorm's brewing. There's a sailor over there, another one over there, the king sailor turning the
king sailor,
the steering wheel thing, potatoes and spare wooden legs rolling around the deck, a seagull up that pole thing.
That pole thing.
Someone reading a treasure map through a telescope.
So I wonder what ship this is, because it's obviously London. You can see the skyline of London in the background, but I don't remember ever seeing that when I've been in London.
A bloke with a white beard carrying a tray of fish fingers. Pirates, all laughing in that horrible throaty way that they do. And at any moment the prospect that you might just sail off the edge of the world. It's a sobering thought. Which they'd have
It's important to note that almost everybody knew the world was round at this point.
Needed because they were all pissed to the bollocks on rum.
The British's mastery of the oceans made Catholic King Philip of Spain furious in Spanish. So he sent his secret weapon to attack England, a woman called Spanish Amanda.
Spanish Amanda, the Spanish Armada, 1588.
The story goes that Drake was playing a leisurely game of bowls on Plymouth Hall when the Spanish attacked.
But Drake didn't let the Spanish attack put him off his stroke. He just carried on playing with his balls.
According to records, when he'd finished, Drake changed back into his normal shoes and thrashed the Spaniards. At war, not bowling. England was victorious.
They used fire ships, and they got a lot of help from the weather. A lot of things had to go their way because the English were supremely overmatched in terms of the number of ships and the firepower. But they had a great strategy. They had great help from the weather, and everything kind of worked out for them. And really, the Spanish Armada in 1588, the reason that's talked about so much is because it's really the moment in which there's a huge shift in power, because England has not been one of the supreme great powers of the world at that point. But that's where England starts to become one, and Spain starts to diminish.
Meanwhile, in Scotland, there was another Mary on the scene, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary and Elizabeth were rivals for the throne.
They were also cousins because, and yeah, rivals for the throne's fair, because if it was true that Elizabeth was disinherited when Henry had his marriage to Anne Boleyn declared null and void, then you could make the argument that Mary, Queen of Scots, was the heir to the English throne because she was the next legitimate person in line. She was also Catholic, so there was a lot of reason for Catholics in England to really want Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Mary was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, and that was where the claim came in.
Catholics loved Mary because they go mad for anyone called Mary. So Elizabeth cut her head off, which made it harder for Mary to take the throne because she could no longer see where it was.
Mary was basically usurped in Scotland by a lot of men who did not want to see her on the throne, and she may have been involved in having her husband killed, and all. It's complicated, but the point is that her very young, very newborn child James is made king, and she really never saw James as he grew up. Unfortunately for her and for the family. But she was held imprisoned for a long time, and eventually there was something called the Babington Plot, which is a plot to overthrow and kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. And Mary may or may not have known about it, but it was enough to condemn her. And Elizabeth acted indignant and shocked when Mary was condemned. She had signed the death warrant, but she claimed that she gave strict instructions for it not to be carried out unless she explicitly said so. It gets carried out, and then she says afterwards that she did not give permission for that. Whether that was the case or whether she was just covering herself for having another anointed monarch killed is another story. But that was kind of the impetus then for the Pope to really get into overdrive and trying to force people to overthrow her.
Elizabeth had ended the rivalry. The final score was 1-0. Elizabeth died without ever marrying, so has gone down in history as the vegan queen.
The vegan queen, the virgin queen. This is Elizabeth and Mary, her sister's grave in Westminster Abbey. And if you look just past there, you see there's this urn right there. You can't really see it, but I'm kind of circling it with my... that is supposedly the urn that contains the bones of the princes in the Tower. These were the brothers. This was King Edward V and his brother Richard of York, who were the brothers of Henry VIII's mother. And the bones were found about 100, I guess it'd be about almost 200 years after the boys disappeared, under some stairs during some renovations at the Tower of London. They've never been tested to see exactly how old they were, whether they could be Edward and Richard. There's hope that maybe King Charles will allow that because his mother would not, and it would require royal permission.
No heirs, which was the olden word for children, making her the season finale of the Tudors. The next top royal was King James.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up right there because I wanted to make this episode specifically about the Tudors. If you have specific videos, because I haven't seen most of these, so I don't know exactly what she covers, are there specific parts of history that she covers that you'd like me to watch and kind of break down like this, let me know in the comment section below. I'll throw up some links here at the end to some other videos, including the one from last night about the drinking game. Check it out. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.